start. It's the magic hour of 6:30. So I'm delighted tonight to welcome you all here, and to Stephen Simmons, who is a fellow of the Society and grew up in Hong Kong, and then had a career in the army, and then went on into banking, and of course lived in Hong Kong again, and also in Thailand and in Cambodia. So this is his second book, I think, is that right? And it's got a wonderful title, Maymyo Days, and we have Kim, who's been helping us out, who is from Burma, and she's been here in England for a year or so, and she says it's a very, very delightful place. So tonight you're going to tell us about Maymyo and the interesting people associated with it. The people, yes. And I had a good read of your book, and of course George Orwell. I saw the photographs that you had of him, which you included. So I think it's going to be a very interesting talk. So thank you very much indeed. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming to this talk, and thank you, the Society, for having me to speak. Whilst the title of the book is Maymyo Days, it's really the subtitle, Forgotten Lives of a Burma Hill Station, which best describes what the book is about. I've written about some, as is the case with most of us, ordinary, normal, in inverted commas perhaps, people, but people who rose to do some extraordinary things. Some turned out to be gifted, a few courageous, others tragic. They lived in the Shan Hills, which lie roughly between Mandalay and the Chinese, Lao and Thai borders to the east. The book is about them, but I've also tried to explain just why they wound up in and around Maymyo. I've tried to explain just what the draw of those hills was. And whilst the book is not about current affairs, given the constant argy-bargy over the correct name of the country, I thought that before I get on to the people who are the book, I should deal briefly with the name politics and then quickly update on the state of things in Burma now, drawing on information which I get from journalists who are fellow members of the Foreign Correspondents Club in Bangkok, and from a very few people with whom I'm in contact in Burma. So Burma or Myanmar, Rangoon or Yangon, Derry or Londonderry, North Yorkshire or the North Riding for that matter, names are emotive, political. It's very, very tricky country. Not long after the remnant Khmer Rouge had ceased to operate, I was having a drink with a colleague in a bar in Siem Reap in northwest Cambodia, a bar which we knew had been, past tense, used by the Khmer Rouge when they were still in the area a few years before. We chatted away about Cambodia this and Cambodia that, but were then somewhat discombobulated to hear a couple of tough, weathered-looking Khmers almost pointedly use the name Kampuchea, whilst talking with one another and glancing in our direction. I smiled weakly, like an idiot, and then looked away. This pair, presumably former Khmer Rouge, were using the name forever and almost uniquely associated with the Khmer Rouge's genocide of 1/3 of the Cambodian people. Many find it a horrible, evocative, for all the wrong reasons, name for Cambodia, which brings back terrible memories for those of a certain age. And by certain age, I mean anyone pretty much north of 55. Burma was run from 88 to 97 by the State Law and Order Restoration Council, which went by the wonderfully and appropriately Orwellian acronym of the SLORC. The SLORC had something of a makeover 9 years later when it became the State Peace and Development Council. Good words, of course, peace and development, as indeed our law, order and restoration. Regrettably, not an awful lot of any of this followed. What did follow, amongst a host of properly dreadful things, were those name changes, Burma to Myanmar and Rangoon to Yangon, ostensibly to rid the country of any colonial links, but in reality, to help to divert attention away from the regime's crackdown on Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, the NLD. So which name? Well, the country itself is split. Supporters of the regime like the name Myanmar, of course they do. Many of those who despise the regime, which includes many Burmans, do not. And the 32% of the population who are Karen, Mon, Kachin, Naga, and other minorities loathe the name as they see it being ethnically exclusive. The name Myanmar being derived from the Myanmar people of the ancient Pagan kingdom, ethnically Burman kingdom. The West is all over the place over what to call it. The BBC has a Burmese service, but then a little confusingly, Radio 4 usually talks about Myanmar. The US government recently passed the Burma Act. The New York Times and The Guardian are absolutely Myanmar, and the Telegraph seems to flip between the two. But key, at least for me, are the remnants of independent local media in the country, both minorities and Burman, who I've listened to once or twice as they dial in on Zoom from darkened rooms. Brave people hanging on like grim death, and reporting as best can, and who operate under the Burma News International umbrella. For these people and for the Burma Human Rights Network, it's Burma. And given I've written about somewhere which some of those minorities inhabit, the Shan Hills, and Burma's good enough for me, certainly in the context of this book. Burma now, as I think probably many of you know, is an absolute mess. There are more armed secessionist groups than all but the most learned and well-informed could possibly keep up with. It's certainly too much for me. There's the Karen National Liberation Army, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, the Arakan Army, the Kachin Independence Army, the Tang National Liberation Army, Chin National Army, Karenni Army, Mon State Liberation Army, and so on, many, many more. Notable by its absence from that list is the formerly dominant United Wa State Army, which began as an ethnic freedom movement, but which then did a grubby deal with the regime a few decades ago. And the Wa State Army is now run by drugs barons who make a fortune out of supplying opium to the world and methamphetamines to Thailand, where it is known as yaba or crazy medicine, and which wreaks havoc. Ceasefires come and truces go. The net result, however, is ghastly, and the wave of violence unleashed by the Tatmadaw, which is not terribly well reported in the press in this country at all, by the Tatmadaw, the army, since they threw out the NLD in 2021, has been dreadful. Thousands killed, 16,000 detained, and over 1 million displaced. One can always hope, but right now the situation in Burma looks grim indeed, which from an entirely selfish point of view is maddening, because I never actually got into the northern Shan states where Maymyo lies. Several times into Rangoon, because that's where much of the information for a book like this is, a book about people. And then a foray into the southern Shan Hills through the Maysai crossing on the Golden Triangle in Thailand, where we then lived. But Maymyo itself was a very different matter, my permit allowing me no further north than Tokyang War Cemetery. And there's no arguing. In Burma, no really does mean no. And then came the coup, and that strife-torn country is now buttoned up tight as a bodice. And post-coup Maymyo, certainly for me, and probably for most of us, remains, for the foreseeable, well beyond the end of the garden. Hill stations themselves, including Maymyo, were not built to be resorts. Hill stations were first simply about staying alive. When the Europeans went east, they moved from temperate climes with which their bodies were familiar to tropical climes with which their bodies were not. They left behind diseases such as smallpox, which their bodies had to a small degree learned to resist, but then exposed themselves to exotic diseases such as malaria, dengue, typhus, and cholera, which promptly began to wipe them out. I recall looking at a brass plaque on the wall of the Wiggly Ting Garrison Church in Taiping, about 50 clicks down the coast from Penang, which recorded the deaths of the wife and three children of a British Army officer, all lost to cholera in 1880 or thereabouts, within a few days of one another. And such brasses and such grave inscriptions are not at all uncommon in Southeast Asia. The colonial authorities needed to do something pretty quickly given the mortality rates, and they did, which was to go up above 3,000 feet to the cool and above most of the mozzies. And the first to do this were the Dutch, who built a hill station at Bogor, around 25 miles from then Batavia, now Jakarta, in the 1740s, which they named, with my appalling Dutch accent, Buitenzorg or Buitenzorg, which translates as free of cares or sans souci. They built a convalescent home there, and to a degree it worked. So they built others, Bukit Tinggi on Sumatra, Kintamani on Bali. These hill stations were convalescents. That is why in the first place they were established. It was only later that they became R&R or holiday destinations when the East India Company established Uttaramund in the Nilgiri Hills in southern India. Similar in the foothills of the Himalayas, Maree near the northwest frontier, and then Darjeeling and Kalimpong. Himalaya hill stations were established at Fraser's Hill near KL and Maxwell's Hill near Taiping, and the beautiful, absolutely beautiful Strawberry Hill above Georgetown in Penang. In Ceylon, they built Nur Elia in tea country, southeast of Kandy. French built Dalat in Cochin China and Bokor in the hills above Kampot in Cambodia. And not forgetting, of course, our anti-colonial American cousins who built a hill station at Baguio, having acquired the Philippines from the Spanish after the 1898 Treaty of Paris and the 1900 Treaty of Washington. The price was $20 million, which I'm sure we would all agree was really quite a bargain for an entire country. Isn't it, really? As tropical medicine improved and mortality rates fell, these hill stations began to exist almost purely as somewhere really rather nice to live. And so schools, hospitals, clubs, and churches were built, and many people spent almost their entire lives there, provided they had money, were European or both. In Lords of the Sun, yeah, I've did it right, good. In Lords of the Sunset, Maurice Collis, some of you may have read some of his books. Maurice Collis, a liberal left colonial officer, wrote that the British Empire was like an old country house which had been lived in by the same family for generations, and that each new generation had added in some way to the house by acquiring more possessions. And that for no particularly good reason, absent-mindedness perhaps, some of the best and most beautiful acquisitions wound up not in the drawing room for all to see, but in the attic, tucked away and forgotten. The Shan states were, thought Collis, stuck in the imperial attic. Now, there is in truth not enough to write a substantial book solely about the town of Maymyo itself anyway. It was a pretty town, high up in the Shan Hills east of Mandalay. And there's without doubt scope for a travel magazine article, which would add some kind of value. And that's the same for several hill stations. Fantastic to visit. Go to Strawberry Hill above Georgetown. Probably wouldn't want to come back if you did, but go there and work your way, as my wife and I did, into the now long closed Prague Hotel. And you can easily imagine Somerset Maugham writing one of his short stories there, which he did. Go to Bandung on Java and see the profusion of near perfect 1930s Art Deco architecture. And you can almost picture a Dutch planter emerging from a hotel, all very atmospheric, but never quite sufficient for a book. And the danger of a book about an old British hill station anyway is that it could very easily slip gently, if harmlessly, into becoming a little fluffy, perhaps. Nice houses here, fun drinks parties there. Interesting in itself, without doubt, as most people do in truth enjoy a little social titillation, particularly if spiced up with a tad of scandal. sexual scandal, preferably, if you please. But such a book might, other than merely satisfy the perfectly understandable desire to amuse and titillate, such a book might lack any further real point or purpose. And the Shan Hills, or more accurately, for this book, some of the former inhabitants offer more. The British Army almost stumbled upon Pinyulin, which was then a small Danu Hill tribe village in 1886 after the capture of Mandalay at the end of the Third Anglo-Burmese War. To the British, it was another rather fine Strawberry Hill. And they established a more permanent military presence there, renaming the town Maymyo, or Maytown, after one Colonel James May of the 5th Bengal Infantry, Maymyo's first military commander. Later in 1900, when the town was connected by rail to Mandalay and thence to Rangoon, it became the summer capital of the Raj, of the British Raj, and henceforth, every year, the government in Rangoon decamped lock, stock and barrel to Maymyo to escape the enervating monsoon months of the coast and of the plains. And then they built large numbers of bungalows, which were given a reminder of home names, as the Brits always did, like Glenarm, Pine Lodge, Oakhurst, Camberley, and inevitably Rose Cottage, and unromantically perhaps Forest Gate. The house is sort of Wuthering Heights meets the Scottish Highlands. I think this family is called Merrick, and I think that's Tapsy's villa. This, I think, rather lovely house. This photograph was taken by a photojournalist friend of mine in Bangkok, Dominic Fulder. Took this about 30-odd years ago. Quite common, quite common in Maymyo and in Callor. And this, the Canda Craig, is a chummery. The chummery, think Officers' Mess. That's where the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation mess, chummery, all chums together, I guess. I first stumbled upon information about these people in Rangoon, finding old books in old bookshops and tea shops, often one and the same in Burma, old maps, photographs, bits of ephemera, which aroused my interest, all got me thinking about Maymyo, what was the evident draw. And I had just read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, and in this book about his time in the Spanish Civil War, he writes about where? Maymyo. Extraordinary, really. A book about the Spanish Civil War, and there's Maymyo. Orwell went there by train from Mandalay, and of Maymyo, he wrote that in stepping out of the carriage, you step into a different hemisphere. Suddenly you are breathing cool, sweet air that might be that of England. And all around you are green grass, bracken, fir trees, and hill women selling baskets of strawberries. Eric Blair, as he then still was, trained at the police training school in Mandalay, and he was subsequently posted to Maymyo for a while, and Orwell being Orwell, it would be difficult not to have one's interest, at least partially, aroused in the place, given his description. And particularly so, given his ordinarily scathing views on places, things, people related to the colonial regime. And then I read a scrap, which was all that was left from the diary of a former resident. She described Maymyo as being lost in the clouds. And I don't think she was referring solely to it being at 3,500 feet. She meant, I think, that it was detached from the ordinary, detached from the humdrum, really. In a stall in Scott's Market in Rangoon, in a pile of dusty old newspaper cuttings, I came across half an article on this man, a Burmese soldier, a general, Yale to use the anglicised name, which he used, Smith Dunn. Smith Dunn, General Smith Dunn, is now completely out of the state's history books, and is forgotten because he was not a Burman, but a Karen. He's been airbrushed from official Burmese history. But what a really good soldier. He won the Sword of Honor at the Indian Military Academy at Dehradun against the competition from the likes of Sam Manekshaw, who later became a rightly exalted Indian Army Field Marshal. He was commissioned into the Punjabis, one of the first, if not the first Burmese to gain a King's Commission. He fought against the wonderfully named or titled Fakir Avipi on the northwest frontier. He won a military cross fighting the Japanese in the Second World War with Slim's 14th Army in General Punch Cowan's 17th Division. And he was also mentioned in dispatches. Military cross on the left as you're looking at it. Burma and Northwest Frontier being the next two. There's it's 4 war medals. And the oak leaf obviously mentioned in dispatches. And he then became, just before the British left in 1948, the army commander. And then just after they left, chief of staff, de facto commander-in-chief of all Burmese forces. He didn't last long in the job, however. He was, after all, not a Burman, but a Karen. And he was forced to hand over to his second in command, who happened to be, unsurprisingly, a Burman by the name of Ne Win. And for those of you not familiar with the name, I'm sure most of you are, but for those of you not familiar with it, Ne Win was the man who mounted the coup in 1962 and who led the country into the military neo-socialist Stone Age from which it's never really emerged. Born near the town of Prome in 1910, Ne Win was given the name Shu Mong. At birth, he later changed his name to Ne Win, which translates, of course, with unintended irony, as shining star or radiant sun. And as history attests, he was absolutely neither. Once forced out, Smith Dunn, like a good soldier, went quietly, even though whilst leaving Rangoon for Maymyo, the regime had a go at killing him and his family by mortaring his car and fortunately missing on the way to Rangoon's airport, Mingladon. He didn't complain about his treatment. He didn't get involved in politics. He simply retired from public life and he spent the rest of his life not back in the Karen area near Bassein where he was from, but in the Shan Hills, mainly in Maymyo, and later a little south in the smaller hill station of Kolor, which is where he died in 1979, aged 72. I stumbled upon this woman, Charlotte Wheeler Cuffe, an Anglo-Irish woman who was brought up in both leafy Sussex, near Midhurst, and in Ireland, and who married Otway Wheeler Cuffe, a Burma Public Works Department man, the PW being the least glamorous of the services, but in truth, probably the most important, given they were responsible for infrastructure in all its forms. And no infrastructure, of course, means no economy. They lived in Burma for decades, some of the time in Rangoon and Tayapmyo, or Mango Town, but most of it in Maymyo. She was a keen horticulturalist and amateur artist, and yet she produced over 100 amazing watercolors of Burma's most exotic orchids and rhododendron, one of which had never been seen by a Westerner before, and which was named after her and actually grew symbiotically on the branches of the host trees. And she found this 9,000 feet up, Mount Victoria in Chin State in the west, absolutely the back and beyond. And yes, she climbed it herself, not that many pony trails then in that part of the world. Her paintings and her map making were superb. Absolutely beautiful paintings. So paintings and map making, there we are. Wherever they were stationed, she drew a map of where they were, which was very useful for her and her husband. Paintings of such quality that they're now jealously guarded by the Botanic Gardens at Glasnevin in Dublin, some amateur. Huh? And then this woman who was neither an engineer nor a landscape gardener designed and oversaw the creation of what were at one time the world-famous Botanic Gardens in Maymyo, which still exist. And she did it pretty much on her own because most men were either away, dying on the Western Front, or if not there, they were in Burma doing the jobs of 2 or 3 men at the same time. So she was asked to take it on fully in 1917, and she did. And she completely succeeded using her own design and sketch map. There's her sketch on the left of a plan of the Botanic Gardens, and that again taken by my photojournalist chum in Bangkok, must be about 30 years ago now. She was the designer, gangmaster, foreman, the lot. The Wheeler Cuffes left Burma in 1920 or 21. Otway, a victim of age-dictated mandatory retirement, and they went home to Ireland, from where her letters suggested that while settled, their hearts remained absolutely in the Shan Hills. I then learned of one Henry Morshead. That's him on the left, and that's him on the right with his family in Maymyo. He was Royal Engineers, half colonel, a twice wounded World War I winner of the DSO, and he mapped goodness knows how much of northern India whilst working for the Survey of India in the years before the war, working for these people, the survey. He took part in some grueling expeditions, including a 1,700-mile circuitous trek to chart the top reaches of the Brahmaputra River, a feat lauded hugely by the Royal Geographical Society. He climbed Everest, almost, but not quite to the top, with the great George Mallory, and lost several fingers and toes in the process. That's Morshead with the Everest recce climbing team. Morshead is front right as you look at it. George Mallory is front left. Second left rear is Charles Howard Berry, 60th Rifles, who was the expedition leader. Morshead was stationed and to all intents and purposes settled in Maymyo with his family after a few more expeditions to, I think, seemingly impossible places. Then in May 1931, whilst waiting for his wife to return to Burma from England, she having put one of their children into boarding school, he was murdered in Maymyo, found dead one morning out in the rides with a gunshot wound to his chest. All sorts of theories as to who the killer was followed, which I have in the book, but he or she, the killer, was never found. That's where he wound up. The artist in the book, Broadway Swinhoe, he wasn't an artist at all by profession, he was a solicitor. That's him. It's mildly eccentric. He began his career in India, as have many other members of his family over the centuries. The family, in fact, came from the small village of Swinhoe in Northumberland, a little north of Alnwick. From India, sensing opportunity, he moved to Burma. He opened up for business in Mandalay, and after visiting Maymyo, he quickly took a lease on a house there called Parkside. Isn't that lovely? I think so, anyway. Could live happily there. On long leave in England, he fell in love with and married this woman, Annie Juxon Jones, for whom Burma would not have been another world, as her father had been a surgeon major in the East India Company. Broadway Swinhoe acted as a solicitor for Duke and for Dustman, Burmese and British, and he became the local lead on what would now be called microfinance, which in itself, I accept, does not get the pulse racing, but these microfinance works, affordable small business debt to locals, were properly good and well ahead of their time. He wrote some rather good Kipling-esque poetry. He acted. He led the hugely successful Burma contingent to London for the Empire exhibition in 1924, and he was a very good amateur artist. He sometimes used his poetry to make humorous yet dark comment or observations on Burma life, as in this brief poem, which in essence is about the sometimes almost suicidal loneliness felt by some British men in Burma, particularly by those up country. A poem. You didn't think you were going to get a poem, did you? There's a poem. Phyllis was an import new by the Bibby liner. Ne'er were eyes such heavenly blue, ne'er was smile diviner. Mouth demurely arched above, Jim and Jack both fell in love. Of course, somebody had to win, which meant somebody had to lose. And when Jack wins Phyllis's heart, Jim took all his hard-earned pelf, tied it round his body, went away and drowned himself in the Irrawaddy. Suicides were not common, but certainly not unknown. The jungles could be very lonely places for the Bombay Burma men. Some drank themselves to oblivion, few went mad, and some just put an end to it all. As I say, not common, but not exactly rare. But onto his art, Swinhoe produced some really wonderful paintings of various of the Brits and of the varied ethnicities in Burma, which constitute now a charming, accurate record of these people as they were then. This is actually one of the Brits, same man, and Swinhoe didn't like him. That's Captain A, defying the Kachins. He's obviously a boozer. He's got his bottle in his left hand, bloodied saber in the right hand, and he single-handedly has defeated the Kachin rebels. Swinhoe didn't like him at all because you see in the bottom right-hand corner, he's written "most poisonous chap." And then on the right, there's Captain A recounting his adventures, boring everyone to death in the bar. Steamer on the IFC steamer on the Irrawaddy. And that's a Chupaso on the left and a Kachin mounted policeman on the right. Swinhoe adored Burma. He was never going to come back. In Rhymes from Roundabout, one of his collections of poetry, he wrote that when you've seen the Great Pagoda and the plains of Far Pagoo and watched the traders trekking to the town of Talafu, you'll be cancelling your ticket. Burma's good enough for you. And he did cancel his ticket and stayed, but he also died young in 1927 when he was in his early 60s and was buried in Mandalay. His widow, Annie, had to go back to England. She never remarried and she lived out the rest of her life in a one-bedroom, third-floor flat in Notting Hill, which must have contrasted rather bleakly with the Shan Hills, I think. And I came across two princesses, Yadana Mai and her mother, Princess Marlat. Marlat was a Shan and had been exiled to India with her family by the British after her family were involved in the resistance in the Shan states in the 1880s. A little while after the family were permitted to return to Burma, Marlat became engaged to the Crown Prince of Sikkim, this chap. Sikkim being a British-controlled statelet up near Nepal. This was an unusual engagement. Excuse me. An unusual engagement in that Sikkimese princes usually married either Sikkimese or Tibetan women, usually the latter, from what I can see. Just weeks before the marriage was due to take place, the prince died of, quote, heart failure, supervening, an attack of jaundice brought on by a chill. In his palace in the capital, Gangtok. He was in his mid-30s and seemingly otherwise fit and healthy. Odd, really. This is one of Marlat's last letters to him. It's an extraordinary letter, microcosms of language and time. Could have been written by an English public school girl in the 1970s, heaps of best love. And that, of course, is because she'd been to such a school up in Kalimpong. Her world had crashed around her ears, so Marlat resigned herself to being, that very cruel expression, on the shelf. But one day at the Rangoon races, she met and later married an Australian buccaneering type by the name of Herbert Bellamy, and they went to live in Maymyo, where Marlat had her only child, Yadana Mai, or June Bellamy, to give her her other Anglo name. June, or Yadana Mai, grew up and was an absolute beauty. She turned down the offer of playing opposite Gregory Peck in the screen adaptation of H.E. Bates' The Purple Plane, a book about an RAF pilot shot down over Burma in the war. She thought the over-Hollywoodization of the film patronizing. And given what could have flowed from the part, that showed some serious moral courage on her part. Then she met and married an Italian who was one of the world's leading malaria specialists working for the UN in the Shan Hills. And extraordinary courage, she personally delivered the ransom money when her husband was kidnapped by the Communist Party of Burma fighters in the late 50s. She actually took the money herself into the jungle. The state would not provide an escort for her. After a tempestuous 60s, she left Burma, poetically almost, or pathetically almost, on the last remaining Burma Airways plane, considered airworthy by the European countries over which it would fly. This is her in later life. She died just a couple of years ago, and in fact, the foreword to this book was written by her Shan Italian son, Michele Postiglione, or to use his Shan name, Ten Lin Ong, and who is now the Limbin Prince. I've written briefly about Felice Beate, not a well-known name now, unless you happen to have studied photography at college, but his photographs constituted the standard imagery of India and of Southeast Asia, as found in newspapers and magazines for much of the late 1800s. He pretty much shaped people's perceptions of the East. Although he was a frequent visitor, he did not actually live in the hills. He lived in Mandalay. So as much as I'd like to, I cannot stretch authorial license or spin to the extent of including him substantially, but I was given very generous access to a private cache of his photographs, many of which had not been seen before. So I would, of course, have been quite nuts not to include him briefly. And of course, some of his photographs. So there was a famous photograph of the aftermath of the storming of the Secundrabad at Lucknow during the mutiny, stormed by the 93rd Highlanders and the Punjabis. Cannonballs and bodies everywhere, and reproduced in umpteen books. It was his. He was in the Crimea a little earlier, and some, not all, of the famous shots of the Valley of Death through which charged the Light Brigade are his. These are a few of his taken in Burma in the 1880s. Charming group of girls outside a temple. Very grand Burmese lady with her attendants around her. I count about 4 cheroots there being smoked happily. The annexation of Wuntho, a fight in the jungle, he's annotated it as. Don't know the regiment, probably Royal Berkshires. Dacoits. When the dacoits were caught by the Brits, they were put inside a compound, as you see here, chained up in front of the judge, and then presumably jailed for a while. But of course, dacoits, like most villains, wouldn't be so foolish to pick on the army because they generally lose. What they did was pick on the poor villagers, as I say, these people do. And the villagers paid a heavy price for it. But when the villagers captured them, then the dacoits paid a heavy price, as you see here. And there are others in the book, which time precludes me from going into now in any depth. Elephant Bill, as he became known. I was speaking to a lady earlier about Elephant Bill. Elephant Bill, as he became known. He fought for 4 years with the Devons in the First War, got a job with the Bombay Burma Corporation on DMOB, and spent much of his life in the jungles and in teak forests. And then in World War II, found himself in Force 136 in Burma, deploying his elephants in support of the 14th Army, before which he trekked 70 women and children out of the country when the Japanese invaded, and then he returned to the war. The writer in the book is Beth Ellis. Beth lived with her sister for a while in Maymyo, her sister May being married to an Indian civil service man, one of the Heavenborn. So inspired did Beth become by living in those hills that she was driven to write. She wrote a highly amusing, gently satirical book, an old dogged copy of which I stumbled upon in Penang, about the Hill Station and about Burma types, and became a successful author, a career curtailed by early death in childbirth in 1913 at the age of 39. And then there were others up in the Shan Hills about whom it is difficult to discover very much of any substance, or in some cases, very much at all. Too much time passed, too many gin slings under the bridge. A former subaltern by the name of Brian, Irish Guards, I believe, mutilated so badly on the Western Front that he quite understandably sought quiet solace. But he sought it not in a remote corner of Ireland, on the edge of a lake at the southern end of the Shan Hills. An artist by the name of E.G. McCall, an Anglo-Burmese born in Maymyo to a High Court judge and his Burmese wife. He fought in the First War, returned to Maymyo and stayed well into the 1960s. Some of his paintings later went for sale at Sotheby's, which gives you an idea. A retired Indian Army officer by the name of Colin Unreeks, 21st Punjabis, went to Mesopotamia in the First War with the Kachin and was partly responsible for the later creation of the Kachin rifles. He retired to write, and he wrote successfully. Not in Cheltenham, however, but in Magog at the northern end of the Shan Hills. It came to an end for some of them because of the usual cholera, dysentery, and malaria. Now, there's no cause of death, obviously, on the graves, but if you look at the ages and look at the when, it was almost certainly one of those three diseases which did for them. It came to an end for most of them when they were invited to leave, rather forcefully, by the invading Japanese army in 1942. Some came back, just a handful, really. But then came independence in 48. Some stayed on, and one or two Brits even returned. I came across one, Gladys Childers, who went back and whose return demonstrates so well the magnetic pull. I wish I could work out what it is. There's something in the air in those hills. The pull of the Shan Hills. Married to Colonel Hugh Childers, who had been Indian Army, 32nd Lancers. They lived in Colour, and he was killed commanding a battalion of the Burma Frontier Force in 41 when the Japanese invaded. He's buried in Tokyang War Cemetery. She was in a POW camp, 3 years, repatriated to England in 45, but then returned to Burma in 1952, age 63. You've really got to want to go back somewhere where your husband was killed and is buried in a country which is post-independence under an already hardline regime, where almost everyone you knew is either dead or has left, and where title to your house is really at the whim of the state. In the event, she lasted only a few years per woman, and then the rigors of the war and the camps took their toll. And then came Ne Win in 1962, and that was pretty much the end of everything. Writing about another, for some, glorious period, the Anglo-Irish writer Elizabeth Bowen, writing of her pre-Irish Civil War childhood summers spent in County Cork, described the image in her mind of that idyllic childhood, so long past, so utterly irretrievable, so completely then, as sunshine elsewhere or firelight in an empty room. That's how it was for many who lived in the Shan Hills too, I think. After Maymyo and the hills, life for most of them was almost certainly no longer quite so lost in those clouds. Thank you for your time.
Do we have any questions? Well, I have one. I'll start off. Oh, well, I was just wondering, what was the population in Maymyo? About how many?
Rose to settlers, shall we call them,
yes,
politely, got up to about 600 max. Absolute max, but of course you had battalions coming through. I mean, when the army had a brigade there at one point, that would have been best part of 2,000 troops. So it varied enormously depending upon what was going on. But there was never a very great or very substantial British population there, certainly. Yeah.
Right. Would you? Anybody else? Would you like? Yeah.
I was saying, how easy it is now to get there.
Not. I mean, I mean, the Foreign Office advice is don't go there, but obviously, it's a bandit state, in my view. The government, I mean, I don't even really think they should be called a government, or even a regime or a junta, because that tends to lend them a degree of legitimacy, and they're so not legitimate. They're a bunch of guys with guns, basically, who nick things, and you know, they will. It would be it's unwise to go there. There's a lot of fighting going on all over the place, and that's not just the various secessionist armies which I mentioned, but Burmans themselves, the younger generation who've been on these iPhone things for years and who know what's going on. I'm sorry, in out with the Burmese borders, and they're fed up too. And there's all sorts of horrors going on there. Unwise to go.
Yeah, talking about travel, I travelled through Burma in the 70s on a 1 week's visa. So I didn't see very much of Maymyo. One thing that I noticed, is people were getting about in stagecoaches.
Oh yeah, that was common form of transport up there. Well, no, apparently still there. Apparently still there.
It was one of the most amazing features.
Yeah.
Compared with the rest.
There are some photographs. So there are many photographs of those stage. Oh, they're still there. A most extraordinary. It almost looks like something out of the Wild West, but the Brits brought them in. Yeah, I know. Most.
Something surprising.
Yeah. Most unusual. That would have been. That was Nabin's days. Yeah, 62 to 89 or 87 thereabouts. Yes, madam. Oh yeah, hammered. Yeah, dreadful. Because the Japanese invaded. Brits didn't do terribly well. They were rolled up all the way to the borders of India. They blew up. Well, for example, the Irrawaddy Flotilla Company had about 650 riverboats. They sank the lot, just blew them down to the bottom of the river. The oil wells all blown up, so it was absolutely flattened. And then when General Bill Slim turned everything around in the 14th Army, and after the success at the battles of Imphal and Kohima, 14th Army started heading south. Same thing happened again. So Burma was absolutely had a rotten time in the war. Yeah. Yes, it did. The Japanese were in there. They used it as a hill station and a headquarters conveniently co-located with the hill station. Yeah, they did. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, why did the images, the painting, the information actually find it in Maymyo, or did you?
Glasnevin, the artist, Charlotte Wheeler Cuffe.
And then
Okay. Yeah. Broadway Swinhoe. Okay. So the artist, all her art is at Glasnevin Botanical Gardens in Dublin. Broadway Swinhoe, his art is held in large part by his. Hang on, let me get this right. A chap I speak to a lot up in Cambridge. It's not his grandson. Yes, it is his grandson. Or is his? Yes, it's his grandson. And he holds the originals. And the JPEGs are also, there are JPEGs of some of them also held by somebody in Maymyo. But it's mainly Professor Alan McFarlane, who's of the Swinhoe family, and his wife of the Swinhoe family, who hold these.
Were there any mission stations? I asked because my grandfather lesbian in Moniwa on Chinwin
Yeah,
in the 1890s to about 1910. And I have a map that he drew of an expedition into the Dunn States.
really. Oh,
Presumably,
interesting.
about
Yeah,
possible places to set up mission stations in that area. But I don't know the end of the story, whether that once Maymyo established, whether mission stations is there.
I believe there was one there. I've seen a photograph of it. And there were quite a lot of mission stations all over Burma, including some American ones in the southeast of Burma. And in fact, General Poye Smith Dunn attended one of those. And that's why I think quite a number of the Karens are Baptists. Yeah, it's the Americans.
Do you have any more? Well, I think we will stop there and thank Stephen very, very much. And if you'd like to pursue your conversation or questions over a glass of wine, you're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.